Hi. So I'm going to give kind of an introduction to the Gateway to Global Aging, which is kind of an online resource that we developed for people who want to use the kind of network, what we generally refer to as the Health and Retirement Studies International Network of Studies together. So this includes studies like ELSA and HRS in the United States and Charles, which was mentioned already. This is a free public resource that's designed to facilitate cross-national and longitudinal studies on aging, and it's funded through the NIA, the United States. So this is kind of broadly, there's actually a few more countries that have been included since I've last updated this map, but more than 40 countries around the world now have a kind of an ELSA type study that's nationally representative inside of that country. They have a lot of the same hallmarks as ELSA, which I'll kind of talk about. And this graph also kind of, or these labels here kind of tell you when different countries joined. So the United States was the first one that started in 1992, followed by Mexico, and then ELSA study in England. And some of the most recent ones have been some of the addition of some of the EU countries as part of the SHARE study. Malaysia, India are some of the newer studies. And this also kind of gives you an idea of the interview periods. This is going up to 2018. So like ELSA, they're population representative. These are all longitudinal studies. They're multidisciplinary. They have coordinated survey instruments. So a lot of the strength of having this network is that often there's the PIs of the different studies themselves will advise each other and their kind of scientific teams on how to design the survey for the most comparability between different countries. And you can't ask all questions the same way in all countries. Certainly language is one thing that is really different in different countries. But there's a lot of effort on the outset of the study design and the survey questionnaire design to really try to make these comparable so that we can learn from what different cultures and countries and institutions and populations are doing, as kind of most of the world right now is experiencing this change in aging demographics. Like ELSA, like Zoe talked about, we have enhanced economic data in most of these studies, so really kind of finely collected economic data. A lot of them have integrated biomarkers, and for almost all of these are publicly available for anyone in the world who wants to use them together for the purposes of research. Some of the core content areas that you're going to find in all of these would be demographics, health, healthcare services, work and employment, economic status, family structure and social network. Most of them also now include kind of like psychosocial questions, emotional well-being questions. I think that's an important dimension, as well as kind of caregiving and volunteer participation. So because there's so many studies, and these are all, most of these studies are, you can see here, are kind of asked every 2 to 3 years generally. There's a lot of data. There's a lot of questionnaires to understand how they're comparable or not, defined. Whether the thing that you're looking for is asked in multiple studies can be hard to find. So we really, the Gateway is funded and designed to kind of be like a central place for researchers who want to use, for instance, ELSA in collaboration with another one of these studies or any of the other studies, particularly together. So what's available on the site itself is an overview of the HRS family of studies. That includes a study overview, and I'll show all of these in more detail. But the survey questionnaires, we have flowcharts which show the survey skip patterns. We have a search function too. We have cross-study concordance tables, a lot of documentation on study comparability. We have interactive graphs and tables. One of our newest features is a policy explorer where we index different policies, different types of policies in different countries. We also have a catalog of the publications using this data. And then the last thing, which is often most helpful for people, is we produce what we call harmonized data sets. We produced one for ELSA called the Harmonized ELSA. That's really a data set that's designed to be comparable with a harmonized data set for another country, one of these other studies. So I thought I'd just go through these. This is a study overview. So basically this is, we try to kind of capture how is this study conducted in each country, how is it maybe different or comparable. I've included the study overview here for MHAS, as I figure it's a sibling study to ELSA, but you might be less familiar with it. So we highlight things like the age eligibility, which is 50 and older. The number of people interviewed per household is one person selected per household plus their spouse regardless of age. Some of these studies can be different on these kind of dimensions. It's nationally representative of urban and rural representative. Like ELSA, it did not sample into institutions, and it does include an oversampling of households in 6 states, which account for a lot of the migration to the United States. There's some interesting work that's done between the MHAS study in Mexico and the HRS in the United States, because there's a lot of migration between those two countries. We also kind of highlight the timing of the core interview collection periods. You can see MHAS has had 5 waves. They had quite a large gap. Actually, they did wave 1 and wave 2, and then they had a 10-year gap. And they came back and re-interviewed the earlier people and also expanded it. And you can see that in addition to kind of core interview, they collect some other kinds of information. They've had they do end-of-life interviews. They've done anthropomorphic and performance measures. They've collected blood-based biomarkers, saliva, hair samples. They're collected at wave 5, and they've also done kind of an HCAP, a harmonized cognitive assessment protocol, and that was in 2016, and then 2021. Like ELSA, they've included refreshment samples, and so we have these kind of like charts for all of the studies, and inside of SHARE, which is a multi-country study, we had these for each country. So you can see kind of the sample size and then the change. You can see that, between 1 and 2, there wasn't a lot of survey attrition, but between 2 and 3, which was a 10-year gap, right, they lost quite a few people, and then they resampled. So you can kind of get an idea of kind of changing sample sizes and refreshments on this sample page. Like ELSA, MHAS has data linkages to different types of data inside of Mexico, including community level characteristics, mortality data. This is their like kind of a pension system, enrollment data, air pollution, literacy rates, and social programs. And lastly, we kind of highlight data access. So for any of these, where do you go to get access to the data? The gateway doesn't usually distribute data. We kind of are a portal to the sites themselves, and we kind of compare information between them. So this is how you get information about actually obtaining this data. And then we kind of highlight the harmonized data sets that we've produced. And so these include kind of a harmonized MHAS, which is the core surveys, harmonized MHAS end of life for their end of life interviews, and harmonized MEXCOG, which is their kind of HCAP data set. We index the survey questionnaires from all the studies. So for instance, for ELSA, you can see that we've got ELSA waves 1 through 9 here. So it has kind of the full questionnaire for the core interview. We also, in addition to the core interview, the end-of-life interviews, life history, health assessment, self-completion, and HCAP interviews are also indexed so that you can search through and find them and find that they're comparable. And this kind of includes like the survey modules themselves and the order of the questions within each module. One of the things that we've built, which can be helpful, I still use it sometimes, are these kind of flowcharts. Survey data can be nice to use, but there are some complications, and one is understanding the skip pattern. So not every question usually is asked to every person, and this is done to save time, and it's nicer for the interviewer and the participant for sure. But for instance, this survey skip pattern here, says whether you have any long-standing illness, yes or no, and then you get asked if you do have a long-standing illness, whether it limits your health activities. But if you're just interested in kind of a prevalence of whether people have health-limiting activities from a long-standing illness, you need to account for who wasn't asked this question and why. So understanding the survey skip pattern in this case is quite helpful. And then this is kind of the finest level we call the survey metadata, which includes the description, the question text, the answer types, answer choices. And for any of these, because there's so many, you can also just search through them. So you can search using a keyword. You can see here, this is searched in smoked, and we've limited it to ELSA 2002, which is the HE module. And so you can find this kind of, if you were looking for smoking, for instance, in different studies, you could find this quite easily using our search. And we also have a topic search for harmonized variables in harmonized data sets. So you can see if we look for like the topic of income and consumption, and this is capital income in the harmonized ELSA, you can see that here we have a self-employment earnings income at wave 1, and then at wave 2, and so on. So you can find variables that way also. In addition, we spent a lot of time kind of building concordance across surveys, so understanding how the surveys are comparable or not comparable. So we've got a lot of domain-specific comparison tables. And these are tables that kind of look like this here, which highlight, under kind of the domain of family demographics, was household size asked, and then like was children asked. This is what we're showing. And while you can see that every study asks about the number of living children, not every study asks about the number of deceased children or the number of children ever born. So this is a helpful also place if you're thinking, I have a topic, I want to use ELSA in some other study. What other study asks kind of comparable things to ELSA that I care about? This can be a helpful place to get started in just selecting which study might be helpful for you. We've also built kind of a working paper series on cross-country comparability. And these are kind of in-depth user guides that are developed with kind of scientific teams inside of this area. So we have them for these topics here, which can be helpful, but they really go through like each survey and say, how is it different? How is it collected? How do experts suggest dealing with those differences if there is a way, or do they suggest that this survey measure was just asked too differently, or there's too much difference between studies to really be able to account for that. And we use kind of these expert recommendations also in the development of our harmonized data itself. And then we also include a bunch of presentations and webinars that we regularly do here on the documentation page. I mentioned we have interactive graphs and tables. And the reason that we built this is because we wanted to kind of let people see how useful using kind of this like nationally representative population aging data on aging populations can be without having to download the data yourself. So we've basically pre-generated using the survey data and the weights, pre-generated thousands of different statistics that people are often interested in. So you can see this graph here is looking at whether you've ever had diabetes in 4 different countries between men and women. This is ever reported, doctor reported. So for instance, one thing that we think is that it's probably underreported in lower middle income countries because they might not regularly have access to medical care where it's diagnosed. And then we have notes saying like where it was coming from, but these are all weighted data, which is kind of another step that you have to think about when using this survey data. Any of these can be downloaded and you can view them in kind of a graph like this, or a table, or a map. One thing that we've also added is contextual data inside of our kind of graphs and tables. So we wanted to be able to think about like a country as a whole and what are kind of macro level indicators that could inform what we're seeing in our survey responses. So this is a chart here where we have individual earnings in the US, and these are all for people aged 50 to 59, so generally working age individuals, and this is by less than high school education. This is high school education, the green is, or vocational, and then the blue is college education. And this is from 1996 to 2014. And then we've plotted just US GDP per capita over the same time period one of the things you can see is that GDP per capita has gone up a lot in the United States, but it's really only for the college-educated people in the United States, people aged 50 to 59 who have kind of seen a similar increase, such as not even as dramatic, but an increase in their individual earnings, whereas for people less than high school, it's like really flat or even starts to go down a little bit in 2014. It looks like, and some of the things that we do just automatically are like, this is earnings, and because it's over time, this is all inflation adjusted into the same dollar amount. So these are inflation adjusted amounts. So I think if you're thinking about like, what can I do with these? What are the data sets? What are interesting population dynamics that are going on? These graphs and tables are a nice place to kind of play around and get an idea of the power of this data. As I mentioned, the last thing the most latest feature that we've built is this Policy Explorer. So again, this is kind of going towards understanding the context or the institutions that are prevalent in these different countries that affect people's options and decisions and choices. So we allow researchers to understand the policies in place at the time of the survey. So they're collected and indexed by country and year. So for instance, if you're using ELSA in 2004, we want to understand what were the policies at 2004, and again in 2016, 2008, or 2006, 2008. Currently, we focus on public pension policies, and we have them available for 10 countries. We're adding, we plan to cover as many countries as we can inside of the HRS cohort of studies. And we're also collecting and making available long-term care policies, which will be available later this year, I think for like 5 to 10 countries also, and education policies. We collect a lot of detail. Our goal for each of these policy collections is that we could collect enough detail to be able to calculate, for instance, in public pension policies, the benefit amount a person would expect, right? So it takes quite a bit of work. And we've developed these PDFs of all the details, and they include things like this is the formula for a state pension, basic state pension benefit here in the UK. And then it also has kind of tables, which would be like these are like the rules to compute the requisite number of years for pension, reaching SRA or dying before April 6th. So they're really quite detailed. And then we're also releasing variables around these, so you can look at like a person at a particular time in the survey, and we could say if they decided to retire at that time point, for instance, what would be their expected pension benefit? And then you could look at that versus how long they continue to work or not work as you watch them move through the survey. And I think this really gets to the heart of trying to look at and compare and learn from what different countries are doing around aging populations and how they're providing for them. We have publications, we have an index of publications. So these are publications that use different types of HRS family of studies data. The nice thing about it is that it's, we've gone through a lot of time and we've selected kind of the topics of the publication and which study it pulled data from. Sometimes it's a little hard, for instance, if you want to just know like who else has used, for instance, ELSA data and looked at cognition. Often like ELSA is not going to be in the title of the publication. Hopefully it's in the abstract, but not always. You would just be looking broadly over cognition in England or something. And so we've kind of done the work of going through and tagging which publications use which study data. We try to update this basically twice a year, pulling from a couple different sources. You won't get usually, you should know that there's some lag between using this and using PubMed or Google Scholar or something like that. And lastly, I'll talk about harmonized data, which is maybe the most useful. Harmonized data contain a subset of the original survey variables. We don't usually try to put every variable that would be asked into the survey into a harmonized data set. We really try to focus on those variables which are most comparable between studies or like just most often used by researchers. And we define those variables as similarly as possible across all harmonized data sets. Each data set combines all waves. Each individual is one record. We use kind of intuitive variable naming. So for instance, a variable like R1 work is whether the respondent is currently working at wave 1. and we make spouse versions of most variables. For instance, that would be named like S2 work would be, so the respondent's spouse at wave 2, whether they're currently working. And sometimes we use study-specific variable names. The example here is R1 LBRF underscore E, which is the respondent's labor force status at wave 1 of ELSA, but we think that like the response scale for labor force inside of ELSA isn't like internationally comparable. Labor force is like very context-specific to countries. And so we've added this kind of like underscore E to the variable name to indicate, hey, it's capturing the same concept, but it's not exactly comparable. And we built these variables to account for survey skip pattern, and we have a lot of documentation for each of these data sets, which I'll show. So here's kind of a really simple example of harmonization. Here you can see, this is at ELSA wave 1, how they asked about smoking. So first you get asked, have you ever smoked? And if you say yes, then you get asked, do you smoke at all nowadays? And on the right, we have the ELSA study in Brazil. And they just asked about this differently. So they said, do you currently smoke? You could answer yes, daily, 2, yes, less than daily, or no. And then if you answered no, they would then ask, have you ever smoked in the past? And you kind of have the similar options, right? So if you just want to make a comparable variable, you kind of have to account for the differences in how these were asked. Also, ELSA is using a 1 and a 2 for yes and no. They're using this 1, 2, 3 for their 3 levels. So this is a really simple example of a variable that we have provided already in the harmonized version of the ELSA and the LC data. But of course, you know, if your analysis wants to look over multiple waves or has a bunch of variables, this is kind of time consuming. And one of the things that we found is that like there were tons of researchers who were doing exactly the same coding, and this is not really efficient. So if we can do this in the best way possible and share these, kind of we've taken a lot of the work out for the entire research community. They also get much more complex. For instance, this is how the Japanese study asked about household savings, and it takes quite a bit of work to go through and make this comparable. This is, I think, one of 12 components of wealth inside of JSTAR. And we've also, for instance, they have unfolding brackets here that ask about if we know that you have a savings account, but you're not able to give us a value, the interviewer says like, is it more or less than some amount of dollars, and then more or less than another. And so we've provided imputations for these, as ELSA has done for the ELSA data also. But basically, you know, if you're not an economist who cares about these different components, you kind of want to just control in your adjustments for total household wealth. This is a ton of work. This is like, I don't know, weeks and weeks of coding or something. And so we've also done this kind of in a standard way across the studies. So for instance, you could just use total wealth variable across different studies, and it's comparable. We've provided a lot of documentation, partly because, you know, we're using studies' original data, and then we're manipulating it in some ways. And so we need to be very transparent about what we've done. You need to understand if we've made any assumptions in that and what we've made. So each harmonized data set has its own codebook. It introduces the harmonized project and study. It overviews survey timing, survey design, sampling framework. We discuss weighting and imputation. We talk about the harmonization process. And then you can see here, this is the harmonized ELSA codebook. We have sections, you know, we have variables divided into sections A through K here. For each of these sections, we show you kind of the breakdown, the tabulations of the variables. We use special missing values, so like .m, .p, .r, for whether the value is missing, whether maybe the question wasn't asked, if it was a proxy respondent, if it was the person refused, for instance, or reasons that it might be missing, but we kind of care about maybe why it's missing. We also detail kind of in text what we try to make as digestible text, the variable creation and assumptions made in the process. So you can see we describe here how we made this ever smoking variable and the spouse variable. We also highlight any cross-wave differences. So like, for instance, smoking did change. The smoking questions changed a little bit in ELSA after wave 1 because they're following up. There's kind of a cross-wave skip pattern happening also based on how you answered at your previous wave. If you were interviewed previously, the question changed a little bit. So we try to capture that. And then we also highlight differences. We kind of use the HRS data as our basis for comparison. So we say, how was this question asked any differently than how it was asked in the study in the United States as our basis of comparison. And the last thing we do is we list all the variables that we use to create this from the original data. So you can go through and, if you want to slightly make it somewhat differently, we kind of are giving you a start here to do that. So now I'm just going to talk about what are the harmonized ELSA datasets, since this is a workshop here about ELSA that we've created. So we have a harmonized ELSA. A current version is version G.2. So this focuses on the core interview data for ELSA. And this also includes values from the ELSA financial derived variables, the non-financial derived variables, nurse data, the pension grid, and the index file. It doesn't include any data which is not publicly released, and this incorporates the first 9 waves of ELSA, and this is available from the UK data service as part of the main ELSA download. If you've downloaded it, actually you already have it amongst all those files in there. And this would be comparable to these set of harmonized core data sets. So for the, I'll say the countries that they cover here instead of all the acronyms. So the United States, Mexico, Europe, Costa Rica, South Korea, Japan, Ireland, China, India, and Malaysia. We've also developed a harmonized ELSA end-of-life data that's built from the end-of-life interviews. In ELSA, they were done at waves 2 through 4 and then at wave 6. This is also available on the UK data service for download. And this kind of focuses on both what people gave in that interview, but pulls in also information from their last core interview to look at kind of changes between their last time they were interviewed and the end-of-life interview. The other harmonized end-of-life data files we have are for the United States, Mexico, Europe, South Korea, China, and Japan. We've developed a ELSA life history file using the kind of wave 3 life, or this is the wave 3 life history survey inside of ELSA. And we've basically, this is a age sequence file. So the life history files are really interesting if you haven't used them. They're a little complicated to use, especially because they'll say like jobs 1 through 10 of someone's life, and they'll talk about the conditions of that job, the times of those jobs. And so what we've done is we've gone through and we've converted those all to ages. So we would say like, what is your labor force status since age? I think it goes through 15 till when they took the survey, basically. So we'll go through all those ages and categorize them according to education, job history, marital history, childbirth, accommodation history, and health history. So these are really rich data. And we've also developed a comparable file for SHARE, the European study, and we're developing a job history file for South Korea. The HRS has also done a life history interview, and so we're developing a harmonized HRS life history currently. We've also developed harmonized ELSA COVID file, and it's built using the COVID-19 interviews that were mentioned earlier. The current version of the harmonized ELSA COVID incorporates waves 1 and 2, or round 1 and 2 of the ELSA COVID-19 sub-study. It's currently under review by the ELSA team, so it's not available on the UK data service, but the data code is provided on the gateway, which would allow you to just generate it yourself. We've also built COVID files that are available for the harmonized HRS, for the HRS, the United States, and for SHARE in Europe. There's a few other ones that we're building too, including, I think Scotland had their own, the Haggis study had a COVID interview that we're developing. Also, do you remember the other ones, Codi? Tilda, the Irish study has one.
And then we're adding additional waves for HRS and SHARE.
Yeah, we're adding additional waves for HRS and SHARE. So this is, of course, this is kind of like new data that's still coming out, and so we're still building this. And the last harmonized data set that we have is the harmonized ELSA HCAP file. It's currently version A, it's under review by the ELSA team, so it's not currently available for download, but we hope it'll be provided sometime shortly, and it incorporates wave 1 of the ELSA HCAP was in 2018. And we've also developed these for the India study, which is the Lassie-Dodd study, for HRS, for Mexico, the Mexicog study, ChileCog, which is in Chile, And for Charles, these are all currently being built, comparable harmonized HCAP data. So to obtain any of this harmonized data set on the gateway, there's a page called Downloads, and you can get links to basically download any of the core survey data, end-of-life data, life history data, or HCAP data. And this includes both like the kind of original survey data and the harmonized data sets. We have links to both. As I said, generally the gateway doesn't distribute data sets itself, but they're distributed through the study. So you would go to that study to find that data. And for the COVID data, we've actually developed kind of a separate site called covid.g2aging.org. And so on this, you have the links to download the different COVID data sets there. To use the gateway, we just ask you to register, so kind of our funders know who's using it and why, and then we kind of stay in contact with you also to give you updates about when new data is available. And to download documentations or PDF, you have to be registered on the gateway. We do ask that if you use kind of harmonized data or information from the gateway, that you would just include this citation. Again, this kind of allows our funders to see like, hey, this is being used, it's a service, and people are using this. You know, the project that this came out of is really to try to encourage people to do these cross-national researches. You know, a lot of collaboration and money has been spent on making these comparable and setting up this network. And I think initially, once it was set up, there wasn't as much research coming out of it as was expected. And they realized that just because it's really hard to use one of these surveys. You know, you could spend you know, a day or 2 days just learning how to use ELSA data, and then to do that in comparison with another study takes a lot of time. And so we've really tried to provide, you know, kind of a site where people can do, we've taken a lot of the legwork out, especially doing this kind of comparative work. So the website is g2aging.org. The COVID website is covid.g2aging. Oh, I'll mention we have a help desk. So this is an email, help@g2aging.org. And our team usually gets back within 24 hours. So if you have questions about, you know, whether some survey measure was asked in a study, we can help you with that. Or you're having trouble accessing any of the studies themselves, or questions about the surveys or the harmonized data sets, you can always email our team. And you can see past webinars, and we have blogs kind of on different topics or different types of variables, different data sets, things like that. So that is it for me, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Yes? So we impute if the study hasn't. We impute financial values and we impute cognitive values. Those are the two imputations we do, only if the study hasn't done them. So you have. So we just use your imputed values. Yeah.
And so the ones that haven't, is it a different method of imputation?
Yes. So for instance, like the HRS uses a really, actually I wrote a paper on how HRS does imputations versus how ELSA does, and there are really different methods. That paper basically tries to look at like the advantages of both methods and then kind of picks what we would consider like a middle point in those. And then that's how we do the imputation. And we do, for the studies which kind of aren't as well resourced as like HRS and ELSA, who don't do their own financial imputations or cognitive imputations, it is consistent how we do those. So we use the same kind of covariates, and we do a predictive mean matching imputation method. Any other questions? And if you're coming to the kind of the hands-on practical portion, I'm going to be walking through kind of actually how to use some of this data this afternoon too.
Just to follow up,
Yes.
the imputations,
Yeah.
cognition, do you have that documented? Exactly what you do for the imputation?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. There's a lot of documentation, including for the HCAP data will often include. Imputations are really important for cognitive data because, of course, someone could say like, oh, I don't want to answer that question, but it's maybe because they don't feel comfortable answering it because they're too far along in a dementia process. And so it's quite important to account for that, right, or your results will look really biased. So yeah, there's a lot of work that's been spent documenting also what we did and why we made those assumptions.
And that information in the code book? Or?
That would be in the code book. Yeah, exactly.
Have you done any imputations on the HCAP one
Yeah, I think the ELSA, yeah, all the HCAPs have imputations done for them, yes. I don't think anyone's trying to have people use the HCAP data without addressing the imputations first. Yeah, certainly. All right, thank you. Oh, yeah, we have one.
Yeah, so I usually try to not think about these imputations, but now that everybody's
Now that we're
mentioning
talking about them, yeah.
everybody's mentioning them, it seems to play such a big role. Like, is there any provision for adjusting the standard errors? Because kind of like.
So, yeah, it depends. I mean, so like for instance, Share, the European study, one thing they've done is they do a multiple imputations method, which they do 5 different imputations, and then you can use that in a way that adjusts for the standard error to allow for the variation between different imputations. So it depends on the methods used. I think for the HCAP imputations that we're doing, they're also multiple imputation, which would allow for the standard errors. One other thing that we do, and I think like ELSA does also, is that for each observation, we'll tell you whether this is like a reported or an imputed and how it was imputed and what assumptions were made in that process. So whether it was like imputed because someone said like, for a financial one, they would use the unfolding brackets, they could say, okay, it's more than 10,000 pounds, it's less than 20,000 pounds, and so it's imputed in that range, which would be kind of closer to, it's more information that we provided in the imputations than someone who just didn't answer the question at all, right? And so those things are usually indicated in the flag variables that are included in all the harmonized data sets, but as well as like the ELSA financial derived variables include that information also.